Tonight we will head to Rikers Island, where yet another alarming report sheds a dark light on the victimization not just of inmates, but also the lengths that folks at the facility reportedly went through to cover it up. Tonight, take a look at the report and hearing from an expert who ran corrections at John Jay Criminal Justice Program. And Governor Cuomo's Tappan Zee funding proposal gets shot down by the EPA. The governor says he's going to appeal the decision. Where will the money come from if the funding doesn't go through, and how deep may you have to dig into your pockets, hope you're listening, Dominic, to pay for the tolls? Plus, Ravens owner Steve Biscotti, he comes out swinging, blasting an ESPN report saying the team and the league attempted to cover up the Ray Rice scandal. And we have an interesting voice. ESPN's Hannah Storm delivering a very personal and powerful message to the NFL about her conversation with her young daughters about domestic violence. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and thank you so much for joining us. And tonight we will begin on Rikers Island, a story we've covered extensively here on RFL. And there is yet another report out now showing deceit, I should say, and double dealing, and it's making its way into the headlines. You may remember back in July, the Times reported on the abuse that the majority of mentally ill inmates endure each day at the hands of not just COs, but also fellow inmates. Well, a secret internal study by the city's Department of Health and Mental Hygiene found that 77% of inmates who were seriously injured had also received a mental illness diagnosis, and yet they were part of general population. Then there was the case of inmate Jose Bautista. He tried to hang himself in his cell by his own underwear. Correction officers responded with tremendous force, and they were caught on videotape beating him while he was handcuffed, perforating his bowel, then deciding to take him for what was called a bus ride here, where they drove around for hours before they ever brought him for medical care. Meanwhile, a federal report just out, conducted by the Office of the Attorney Preet Bharara, found a deep-seated culture of violence against adolescent inmates at Rikers, carried out by the COs, those correction officers. The report said young inmates that were beat with batons, radios, broomsticks, many of them so afraid of being beaten that they asked to be put in solitary confinement for their own protection. And after word of violence against adolescent inmates spread, well, a new report has come out showing that, well, it's not just the case that numbers are going down. In fact, it may be the opposite. Times again here breaking the story, reporting that dozens of corrections investigators produced a confidential report which, quote unquote, concluded that hundreds of inmate fights had been completely omitted from departmental statistics. So while folks said, hey, the violence is going down, it turned out there was more than 300 such reports that were never even put into the final reporting. And that same report shows that city officials provided only the sanitized report to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, the aforementioned Mr. Bharara. Correction Officer Union President Norman Seabrook, he told our own Dominic Carter back in July that he was concerned about the safety of the corrections officers and not the inmates.
Until they have broken bones in their face.
Let me ask you a very serious question. If I'm a New York City correction officer, do you think that I am Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier and you have a referee in the ring that says, okay, no hitting below the belt, no doing this, no doing that? No. These inmates attack New York City correction officers. They attack other inmates. They attack civilians in the Department of Corrections.
So are you admitting your officers are brutal?
I'm saying to you that a correction officer must use whatever force is necessary to terminate the incident. And I am certainly not going to say to them, wait a minute, before you decide to defend yourself and swing and punch this person, don't swing too hard, because we don't want no accidents to happen here where they get injured. No, it doesn't work like that, Dominic. You fight because your life depends on it. These are murderers, rapists, arsonists. These are individuals that take the lives of people in the public 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Gun violence is out of control. Do you think that they come there and say, let me play nice with the correction officers?
Okay, but that doesn't give the correction officers the right to violate the law.
No, it doesn't.
Let me move on, because I have a lot to get to, including a very controversial quote from you.
Go ahead.
But I'm quoting Daniel Sealing now. This is what he had to say, and he was the director of the jail's mental health services. Let's take a look at this.
He was the director?
Yes, but let's take a look at what he had to say, if we can go ahead and put that up. There's lots of brutality. horrible brutality. Now, how do you explain that, Mr. Seabrook?
I think that this person just has an axe to grind.
Really?
Absolutely, Dominic.
Why would he have an axe to grind against correction officers?
Because you said he used to be.
Right.
Okay, and at the end of the day, we don't allow them, mental health or anybody else that comes into the confines of a jail, to do what it is that they want to do. Dominic, we are always going to be looked upon as the bad guy.
Okay. In his conversation, we'll bring Dominic in a little bit here. There was zero contrition on the part of Mr. Seabrook, who again runs the union here that is in charge of the corrections officers in this question. Now, earlier today, we spoke to Martin Horn. Martin Horn knows this situation very well. He was appointed by then Mayor Bloomberg to be the commissioner of the New York City Department of Corrections, and now he's professor over at John Jay College. We spoke earlier today about many things, including the new report that came out. Martin, you know, with all the problems that Rikers has had, from the problems with the mentally ill population, the juvenile facility, the huge number of fights that have been there, with all that, and seemingly now the oversight and the feds getting involved, somehow, some way it's gone from bad to worse. Is now we get reports that the data of what was actually going on behind those walls was distorted and kept out of that file. More specifically, if the Times didn't get their hands on it, hundreds of fights would have gone unreported. How can this happen?
Well, look, this is a big, complicated system, and let's bear in mind that we're talking about something that happened several years ago, before the current administration came in. Whenever you have a system similar to CompStat, and that's what the process at DOC was at the time, we called it teams, you have to have an audit function precisely because these errors get made. We've seen allegations of this kind of misrepresentation of what's going on in police reports as well. So it's not uncommon in these kinds of performance managements for this to occur. And I think it's very important to keep in mind that the Times story is reporting on something that happened in 2010, 2011.
Martin, do you think the biggest problem here, is it the population and the makeup of the population, including the mentally ill, as well as also having the juvenile population at the same broader facility? Or is it they don't have enough COs, or the COs aren't managed the right way?
All of the above. I think that there is a very large number of persons with mental illness who are confined in several facilities on Rikers Island, and that's a real problem. I think there's a real question that as a community we need to be asking about why we have so many mentally ill people in our jails rather than in appropriate mental institutions. That's a very big question. The jails were never built to accommodate these people. The staff was never trained to accommodate these people. The procedures of the jail are premised on the assumption that the population that you're working with are people who are not mentally ill. That's number one. The second issue is the adolescents. And keep in mind that of the 10,000 prisoners in New York, probably only about 700 are adolescents. There have been proposals made to change the age of criminal responsibility in New York State and raise that age from 16 to 18. They have lain fallow in the legislature, and if the legislature would act, these young people would be housed in more appropriate facilities. I think one of the things that has happened at Rikers Island over the last several years has been tremendous staff turnover. There were a lot of people hired in the late 80s and 90s, and 20 years have gone by. They have a 20-year pension, and so in 2009, 2010, there was a lot of turnover. They lost a lot of experienced staff, and a lot of new people came in. So there is a lot going on.
You know, you were quoted in a recent Times piece as saying there was very little interest when you were there in expending political capital and financial capital on the jails. And again, reminding folks, you were commissioner during Bloomberg's first 2 terms. And my question is, translate what that means from a practical basis to our audience.
Well, for example, I had put forward a proposal that would have removed almost 4,000 prisoners from Rikers Island and moved them into facilities located in the boroughs, in the Bronx and in Brooklyn, using existing jail facilities, the Brooklyn House of Detention in Brooklyn and the barge that currently sits in the South Bronx, and there was opposition to it. There was no support from the city council. In fact, there was opposition from the city council, and it was very difficult. There was a real NIMBY attitude there. So I think a large part of the solution to the problem would be decentralizing the city's jail population into smaller, more manageable facilities closer to the communities they serve. There was no political will to do that. I was out on my own. The financial issue was really that we were treated like every other agency in terms of taking cuts, and we had taken so many cuts that there was no place left to cut. The problem with jails is that the prisoners are there. You can't cut services. You can't cut staffing. You're running dormitories now with only one officer in them. We had reached the point where there was no place further to cut.
You know, Martin, we sat down with Norman Seabrook, who really runs the union that the COs are represented by, and there was very little, if any, contrition from Mr. Seabrook here, saying, don't look to the COs, look to management. What do you say about that? How much of the problem are the correction officers that either they're getting very little oversight or there's very little consequences when they really go way overboard with these inmates?
Well, look, at the end of the day, it's the responsibility of the management to run the jail system. And so you can't wash your hands of that responsibility. I think that, you know, Mr. Seabrook is a union leader, and he's a very good one, and he has an obligation to represent his members. But it is true that as a result of contractual obligations that previous city administrations have entered into, as well as civil service law, it is very difficult to hold officers accountable. Unless an officer is convicted of a crime, it's difficult to terminate an officer. Even where an officer is suspected of wrongdoing, there are limits on how long you can suspend that officer for. The adjudicatory process is different from that in the police department. The commissioner of the Department of Corrections is not the final word on staff discipline, and it was not uncommon for my decisions to terminate employees to be overturned by the New York City Civil Service Commission.
Finally, Martin, so we're not having the same conversation a year from now. What has to happen at Rikers so it's the kind of facility that many people had hoped or expected it would be?
I think that Commissioner Pont needs time. He needs the support of the de Blasio administration. I think that he needs to build up his middle management workforce, and I think that he needs an investment from the city in additional staff resources and money for staff training.
Martin Horn, thank you very much for the time. I appreciate it.
You're quite welcome.